The mansion's main hall gleamed like a glass palace. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light onto politicians, business people, and celebrities. Tables laden with champagne flutes and silver dishes gave the space an untouchable appearance. Everything seemed solid, eternal, indestructible. But behind the luxury there was a hidden tension no one dared name. The floor, silently, held secrets. A dull crack shattered the soft piano music. Guests froze, searching for the source of the strange sound. Then, as if from a nightmare, a huge crack opened in the ornate ceiling. Shards of plaster rained down on expensive dresses and impeccable suits. Screams echoed, glasses shattered on the marble, and the party suddenly descended into absolute chaos. The tycoon, red with rage, raised his voice above the confusion. "You're paid a fortune and you get nothing," he roared, grabbing one of the engineers by the tie. The entire room watched in silence, shocked by the outburst of fury. The engineer tried to stammer out technical explanations, but his voice died under his boss's murderous glare. "If this house falls, you fall with me," the tycoon added, spitting the words with contempt. The already tense atmosphere became suffocating. Meanwhile, in the background, a man in simple clothes tried to approach. The old gardener, with a hunched back and calloused hands, kept a watchful eye on the walls. He knew every stone, every root on that property. He tried to approach, cautiously, but was brutally repelled. The magnate pushed him back in front of everyone as if he were an intruder. "And you? Take care of the flowers because you have no brains," he shouted, drawing nervous laughter from some guests. The gardener didn't answer. He simply brushed the dust off his sleeve and stepped back, with the silent dignity of someone who had endured too much humiliation. His eyes, however, remained fixed on the crack that ran through the walls like an invisible serpent. There lay a mystery he recognized but had no room to reveal. The party continued in tumult, but his mind was already working in silence. The tycoon, still furious, slammed his fist against the mahogany table. 30 days, he announced, his voice reverberating throughout the room. 30 days to resolve this, or you'll all be out. A golden clock on the wall marked that moment. Its ticking now seemed louder, as if it were a countdown to an inevitable judgment. The deadline had been set, and no one had the courage to contest it. The engineers, one by one, adjusted their glasses, tablets, and digital clipboards. Some murmured superficial diagnoses, others debated who was to blame. But deep down, everyone was bewildered. No calculations explained the violence of the collapse. And above all, none of them wanted to take responsibility. The tycoon's fear outweighed the search for the truth. Every glance exchanged revealed insecurity and a bruised ego. The crowd of guests dispersed quickly, but rumors were already spreading. Journalists whispered about the mansion's fragility. Politicians exchanged ironic glances. The tycoon's reputation, built on steel and concrete, was beginning to crack like the walls around him. The public humiliation stung more than the structural danger. He knew he couldn't fail, not in front of so many watchful eyes. The gardener walked into the garden, away from the tumult. His aging body moved. Slowly, but his gaze remained alert. Every tree, every root, seemed to whisper secrets that engineers would never hear. He had no drawing boards or drones, but he had memory. Memory of when those foundations were laid. Memory of where the ground gave way and where the earth breathed. But no one would hear him. Not yet. At the top of the mansion, the golden clock chimed once more. Seconds dragged by, but the sound was relentless. Tick-tock, tick-tock. And with it the war between pride and wisdom. The magnate looked at the engineers with disdain, convinced that only money would buy the solution. The gardener, however, already sensed. The answer lay not in calculations, but in invisible roots, buried in time. The magnate, Richard Valance, walked the halls like a general at war. His mansion was a symbol of power: marble columns, paintings by European artists, and Persian rugs that cost a fortune. For him, every detail was not just luxury, but proof of his superiority. Anyone who entered knew they were standing before an empire. But now, the crack running through the walls threatened not only the house, but the very image he had built. From a young age, Richard had learned to crush anyone who doubted him. He inherited part of the fortune, but multiplied it with ruthless business dealings. In meetings, his voice was the law. In the newspapers, he was portrayed as a visionary. However, behind the expensive suit, there was a man consumed by insecurity. The fear of losing respect was greater than the fear of material ruin. For him, the collapse of the mansion was a direct attack on his authority. The morning after the party, he gathered the engineers in the main hall. His eyes flashed with impatience. "You have 30 days, not a minute more. I want reports, calculations, and above all, results." The words rang out like gunshots. The silence in the room was heavy. Some engineers hurriedly took notes, others simply avoided eye contact. The air was thick with tension, and no one dared to challenge him. Richard paced back and forth like a judge awaiting the confession of the accused. He pointed to the cracks with disdain, as if they were personal flaws. "This house isn't just stone and concrete, it's my name. And my name can't fall." His speech wasn't technical, it was emotional. More than saving the mansion, he wanted to save his mask of invincibility. Pride spoke louder than reason. The engineers, renowned at international universities, felt humiliated. Accustomed to being treated like geniuses, they were now treated as incompetent. One of them, the youngest, ventured to say they would need time for accurate diagnoses. Richard leaned closer, almost touching his face. "Time is what you don't have. Every second lost is one less brick in my empire." The young man swallowed, lacking the courage to respond. Meanwhile, employees walked through the hallways, cleaning up the debris from the previous night. The sound of brooms against the marble contrasted with the silent tension of the meeting. The gardener, passing by with a bucket, took in everything out of the corner of his eye. He knew that look from his boss, the same look he used when he fired employees with a signature. Richard didn't tolerate failure, and he always needed someone to blame to bear the brunt of his wrath. The tycoon ended the meeting by banging his cane against the floor. 30 days, gentlemen. After that, I don't care if you're doctors or apprentices, you're out." With each word, his authority seemed more fragile, as if he were trying to convince himself he still had control of the situation. The engineers left in silence, carrying briefcases and clipboards. None of them had a real plan. The mansion was a puzzle that defied their formulas. In the hallway, Richard was approached by an aide who suggested calling in foreign experts. The tycoon, however, arrogantly refused. "If 20 engineers aren't enough, 20 foreigners won't save my honor either." It wasn't just about the house. It was about not admitting weakness in the face of his own elite. For him, acknowledging outside help would be admitting vulnerability, and that was the word he feared most. In the distance, through the window, the gardener watched the same crack, discreetly widening. As the engineers discussed numbers, he saw the problem growing with the naked eye. The old man's silence was interpreted as ignorance, but it hid wisdom. He already sensed that the evil lay not in the visible walls, but in something deeper, buried beneath the earth that everyone ignored. Yet he remained silent, invisible as ever. That night, Richard remained alone in the living room. He ran his fingers over the crack as if touching an open wound. The luxury of the house seemed to mock him. The golden clock cruelly marked time, reminding him of the deadline he had imposed on himself. For the first time in years, the magnate felt the weight of fear. But it wasn't fear of the house falling. It was fear of falling with it, in front of all who revered him. The next morning, a line of luxury cars pulled up in front of the mansion. 20 hastily hired engineers alighted, each carrying briefcases, tablets, and measuring instruments. Some wore starched suits, others impeccably white lab coats. Their expressions conveyed confidence, almost arrogance, as if they carried ready-made solutions in their pockets. The tycoon greeted them with a look that mingled hope and menace. The trial by fire had begun. The first engineer introduced himself with a confident smile. "I'm a specialist in metal structures, Mr. Valance. No anomaly can withstand my analysis." Another, older, spoke in a deep voice. "Historic buildings, foundation diagnostics. I've restored entire palaces." Each sought to impress, boasting of brilliant resumes, as if in a vanity contest. The magnate listened, but didn't smile. He knew words wouldn't sustain his mansion. Meanwhile, the gardener, invisible in the background, watched. His dirty boots contrasted with the engineer's shiny shoes. He carried only a small hoe, a humble instrument compared to the modern machines that arrived by the truckload. No, one spared him a glance. To them, he was just part of the scenery, a living accessory among the plants he tended. The old man, however, knew every stone in that garden better than any technical map. The engineers spread out through the mansion's corridors. Using thermal cameras, laser scanners, and sophisticated software, they scoured every corner, measuring angles and vibrations. They pointed to colorful screens filled with graphs, like priests consulting digital oracles. The tycoon watched anxiously, almost convinced that he would finally have a definitive answer. The sound of the equipment replaced the music that had previously echoed through the house. Now, science set the pace. One of the younger engineers, excited, announced, "Probably underground infiltration, sir. We've seen it in large urban projects." Another immediately disagreed. "No, it's clearly structural settlement, typical of poorly designed foundations." The argument grew, with each trying to impose their theory. The mansion became a battleground of egos. Richard watched, but his anger grew. He didn't want theories, he wanted certainty. Outside in the gardener examined the trunk of a centuries-old tree. He touched the bark with his rough hands, as if reading a book in silence. He noticed some roots emerging discreetly near the house's foundation. It was an ancient sign, one he had seen decades ago in small buildings in the region. He sighed deeply. He knew those roots held answers, but he also knew no one would listen. When the engineers returned to the room, they presented preliminary reports. Diagrams, tables, and astronomical cost figures appeared on projected screens. They spoke of millions of dollars to reinforce the structure, of imported machinery to stabilize the soil. Richard listened, but his expression hardened. Each figure was a threat not only to his wallet, but to his reputation. The more they talked, the more distant a solution seemed. He demanded action, not bureaucracy. The gardener tried to approach discreetly, clutching his hat to his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by an engineer who pushed him aside. "Watch your clipboards, man! You'll ruin the material." The tycoon laughed condescendingly and turned his attention to the technicians. Once again, the silent wisdom was ignored. The old man returned to the garden, wounded not by the collapse of the house, but by the loss of respect. Inside the mansion, engineers were drawing up grandiose plans. Digital maps covered the walls, displaying colors and tangled lines. Each one jostled for space, trying to outshine their boss. But despite the technological spectacle, the cracks remained. They slowly widened, like open wounds that mocked the calculations. The ever-present sound of the golden clock reminded everyone that time was ticking mercilessly. The 30 days seemed ever shorter. That late afternoon, Richard concluded the first round of diagnostics. He looked at the group and said, "You have 29 more days. I don't want excuses. I want solutions. Tension filled the air. The engineers, though proud, felt the shadow of failure. The gardener, in the distance, saw what they couldn't. The house wasn't collapsing from above, but from below, and this truth sooner or later would come to light. In the quietest corner of the property, far from the mansion's lights, lived the old gardener. His name was Eli, but few knew his name. To most, he was simply the man of the plants, the one who appeared early and disappeared at dusk. His white hair reflected the years, and his calloused hands were proof of a lifetime of work. Yet there was a firmness in his gaze, as if carrying secrets from the soil. Eli wasn't just a gardener. Decades ago, as a young man, he had participated in the construction of the mansion. He had carried stones, planted trees, and leveled the ground. He knew where the ground was firm and where it gave way. As engineers passed by, he learned by observation. He never studied at a university, but life had been his school. Every root that sprouted, every crack that appeared, he read as words from an invisible book. Despite this, his position had always been one of invisibility. The magnate tolerated him as part of the house's living decor, but never recognized him as someone with a voice. Eli knew his place in the mansion's social scene. He was always in the background, taking care of what no one noticed. He was invisible at dinners, ignored at meetings, and forgotten in official photos. Only the silent plants returned his respect. That morning, as engineers hurried around with tablets and drones, Eli watered the roses in the garden. He watched the threads of the cracks run through the wall and down to the ground. His eyes followed the invisible line, as if connecting the house to the deep roots of the earth. This isn't the work of infiltration, he muttered to himself, but he kept the words to himself, knowing they would be discarded if spoken aloud. As he walked along the side of the mansion, he passed the centuries-old fig tree he had planted as a boy. He touched its gnarled trunk, feeling the pulse of life beneath his palm. The tree had grown so tall that its roots, thick as serpents, were already spreading across the grounds. Eli knew those roots, strong, persistent, capable of breaking rocks. Deep down, he already sensed. They were the ones silently eroding the foundations of the house. In a rare moment of pause, he sat on a wooden bench, surveying the grandeur of the mansion. To everyone, the building was a symbol of power and wealth. To him, it was also a symbol of arrogance, a giant built on fragile foundations, ignoring the voice of the earth. Eli smiled slightly. I knew that sooner or later nature exacts its price, and perhaps this was the day the mansion would have to listen. As he pondered, he was interrupted by a butler who hurried him on. Eli, the boss doesn't want you hanging around the engineers' meeting. The old man nodded without arguing. He was used to being pushed to the sidelines. However, his mind remained alert, connecting signs, connecting dots that the experts missed. Gardner was like a silent witness, carrying the wisdom of time on his shoulders. The engineers in the distance laughed and discussed theories. They seemed oblivious to the simplicity of the land they walked on. Eli, hose slung over his shoulder, murmured, "They look up, but forget what's below." It was the sum total of everything he had learned in life. Grandiose structures crumble not because of their heights, but because of neglected foundations. And the magnate's mansion was repeating the same lesson so many other proud structures had already taught. In the silence of the garden, Eli pulled out a weed growing close to the wall. As he pulled it, he saw small loose stones fall with it. It was a clear sign that the ground was shifting. He looked up at the mansion, shining proudly, and thought, they think it's the roof, but the problem lies in the roots. He put the stone in his pocket as silent proof of his observation. It was the beginning of his discovery. As the sun set, the engineers left the mansion with their reports. Richard followed them with stern looks, demanding haste. Eli, on the other hand, returned to the garden, where the noise of the city didn't reach. There, in the stillness of the earth, he found answers no one sought. For him, there was no rush. There was patience. And it was precisely this patience that one day would lead him to reveal the truth hidden beneath the mansion. The next morning, the engineers returned en masse, like an army of scientists. They carried boxes of instruments, cables, laptops, and even drones, which hovered over the mansion's rooftops. The tycoon watched their every step, arms crossed and expression grim. He wanted quick answers, unshakable certainties. Every minute, the ticking of the golden clock reminded him that the 30 days were running mercilessly. The engineers divided into teams. Some measured the ground level with sensors. Others roamed the hallways with thermal cameras. The sound of beeping equipment filled the house as if it were a hospital in the middle of surgery. Preliminary reports appeared on the screens. Temperature variations in the subsoil. Small, superficial settlements. Nothing, however, explained the severity of the cracks. Richard chewed his nails in silence, his patience hanging by a thread. One of the most renowned experts asked to lift part of the floor for analysis. Workers lifted boards, revealing damp earth below. The engineer smiled with conviction. "Here's the culprit, sir. Underground seepage." He spoke loudly, as if wanting to close the subject. The tycoon narrowed his eyes. "Are you absolutely sure?" The voice sounded like a veiled threat. The man hesitated for a second but maintained his posture. "Without a doubt." However, another engineer objected. "It's not infiltration. It's structural settlement. The foundation was miscalculated from the beginning. This soil would never support that much weight." The room filled with murmurs. Two experts, two opposing theories. Richard banged his cane on the floor furiously. "Then explain to me, who's right?" Neither dared answer. The division between them revealed more insecurity than clarity. Meanwhile, Eli watched from afar. He saw the men measuring, discussing, and drawing colorful graphs. None of them, however, bent down to feel the earth with their hands. To the gardener, the mansion spoke through simple signals, the creaking in the walls, the slight leaning of nearby trees, the loose stone he kept in his pocket. But he knew that if he opened his mouth, he would be ignored. He preferred patient silence. Late in the afternoon, the engineers gathered in the hall to present their diagnosis to the magnate. They projected graphs onto a giant screen, displaying curves and formulas that most of them found incomprehensible. They spoke of weeks of monitoring, additional testing, and expensive drilling. Richard interrupted. "And the solution? What's the solution now?" None dared give a definitive answer. It was as if everyone recoiled under the weight of the decision. The tycoon rose from his chair furiously. "You're 20 brainiacs and you can't see the obvious? I paid a fortune to listen to technical excuses?" The silence weighed like lead. The engineers lowered their eyes like scolded children. Their pride was beginning to crack, just like the walls of the mansion. Richard dismissed them with a brusque gesture, making it clear his patience was at an end. Outside, journalists waited anxiously. Rumors were already spreading through the city. The tycoon's mansion was on the verge of ruin. Every word the engineers spoke would be fodder for the newspapers. But fearing reprisals, none of them spoke. They simply hurried into their luxury cars, avoiding the uncomfortable questions. The scandal, however, had already been planted. Richard's reputation was beginning to crumble in public. Eli, sitting on the wooden bench in the garden, watched the commotion. He saw the engineers leave without answers, the chief walk furiously into the mansion, and the reporters wave their microphones to no avail. The old man sighed deeply. It was clear to him that the mathematicians were blind. The truth lay not in graphs, but in the roots that wound invisibly beneath his feet. He remained silent, as if guarding a precious secret. That night, as the golden clock chimed the hour, Richard stared at the cracks illuminated by lampshades. I felt every line on the wall was a laugh from the mansion itself. 30 days, he muttered to himself, his fists clenched. In the garden, Eli gazed at the same starry sky and thought differently. It wasn't time that would reveal the truth, but the courage of someone to see where no one else would. 2 days after the first inspection, the mansion seemed to breathe in tense silence. The engineers walked the hallways like shadows, avoiding their boss's gaze. Richard, however, felt every minute like torture. The golden clock hanging in the hall had become his greatest enemy, reminding him that the days slipped by like sand. Then, when he least expected it, a loud crash shook the house, echoing throughout. It was the library, one of the oldest and proudest rooms in the mansion. Oak bookshelves, filled with rare books, suddenly collapsed when part of the ceiling caved in. Dust and fragments fell onto centuries-old manuscripts. Priceless works were destroyed in seconds. The sound of the shelves toppling sounded like a roar of condemnation. For Richard, it was more than a material loss. It was a direct attack on his legacy. He rushed in, his cane banging hard against the floor, nearly tripping over the debris. His eyes blazed with fury. "Incompetence!" he shouted as he saw the engineers approaching in alarm. "You assured me it was infiltration. Where is the infiltration now?" No one answered. Silence of the technicians was deafening. The walls, stained with cracks, seemed to laugh at the collective failure. One of the engineers tried to justify himself, showing graphs on his tablet. Richard snatched the device from his hands and hurled it against the wall. The impact resounded like a gunshot. "Enough with the numbers. I want solutions, not excuses." His voice echoed like thunder, reverberating through the library's rubble. The technicians lowered their heads in defeat, like soldiers without command in the middle of a battlefield. Meanwhile, Eli appeared discreetly at the door. His eyes welled up at the sight of the destroyed books, many of which he had helped organize as a young man. He recognized the smell of earth mixed with dust, a clear sign that the cracks were coming from underground. The gardener observed the chaos unnoticed. He knew the garden's roots were silently at war with the mansion's foundations, but he kept his mouth shut. Richard kicked pieces of wood as if he wanted to crush the problem with brute force. "This mansion is my crown, and you're letting it fall." His eyes were red, not just with anger, but with fear. The library was the intellectual heart of the house, and now it lay in ruins. The news would spread like wildfire, and he knew it would soon be in the newspapers. "The Valance mansion collapses." The engineers tried to regroup. "We need more time, sir. With drilling in the ground, we might be able to—" Richard interrupted with a harsh gesture of his hand. "You've already taken up too much of my time." His voice was a cold cut. The atmosphere became unbearable. Some technicians looked down at the ground in shame, while others glared at their boss with hidden resentment, but no one dared contradict him. Eli retreated to the garden, feeling the weight of his impotence. He touched the ancient fig tree again, noticing how its roots spread like veins beneath the earth. "This is where the problem lies," he murmured. But who would listen? At that moment, he was just the ignored gardener, an invisible figure among men with stellar resumes. Yet, deep within, he carried the certainty that the truth would soon come to light. That night, Richard remained alone amid the library's ruins. He picked up one of the intact books, covered in dust, and ran his hand over the cover. It was a work on ancient empires. He flipped through a few pages and saw illustrations of ruins. The coincidence made him shudder. Nothing is eternal, he thought, but immediately dismissed the idea. He couldn't admit weakness. Not now. Not before so many eyes awaiting his downfall. Outside, the gardener sat silently, gazing at the mansion against the night sky. The illuminated windows flickered like troubled eyes. Eli knew the library's collapse wasn't the end, but merely a warning. The ground still had more secrets to reveal. The entire house, like a sick body, showed signs of collapse. And while the magnate clung to his pride, the roots continued their relentless work. The morning after the library disaster, Richard gathered the engineers in the main room. The atmosphere was like a wake. The debris had not yet been fully cleared, and the smell of dust permeated the air. The magnate tapped his cane impatiently against the floor as the technicians adjusted their papers and laptops. "I want solutions," he said firmly, "and I want them now." The silence that followed was suffocating. The first engineer raised his hand, trying to sound confident. "Mr. Valance, the only way to stabilize the mansion is to reinforce the foundations with high-pressure concrete injections." He spoke in technical terms, projecting three-dimensional images. "It will cost something around $10 million. The figure made some present widen their eyes, but Richard remained motionless, his face set like stone. The weight of the sum, however, had hit him hard. Another engineer intervened, nearly running over his colleague. "This technique isn't enough. We'll need deep, imported steel piles to support the total weight. The cost could reach $15 million. He spoke fervently, as if competing for an invisible trophy. Richard gritted his teeth. $15 million to save something that had already cost him so much? The mansion felt like a bottomless pit, sucking away his fortune and his patience. A third expert stood up, colorful graphs on his tablet. "There's still the possibility of partially demolishing the east wing and rebuilding it. It would be safer in the long run." The tycoon, incredulous, interrupted. "Demolish? You want to destroy my house to save my house?" The irony in his voice made the others flinch. The atmosphere became suffocating, each engineer trying to sell their idea as the only salvation. As the debate heated up, Eli walked down the hallway carrying a bucket of water for the plants. He heard fragments of the million-dollar figures and sighed. To him, those sums were absurd. Not because he was unaware of the value of the works, but because he knew they were diverting attention from the root of the problem. The earth was unimpressed by millions. It simply followed its silent course. But no one wanted to hear this simple truth. Richard stood up abruptly, knocking over a chair. "You're turning my mansion into an auction. 10, 15, 20 million. Who can guarantee that after this the cracks won't continue?" His voice echoed off the cracked walls, heightening the sense of fragility. The engineers tried to calm him, but their words were just noise. The magnate no longer saw experts. He saw merchants trying to profit from his misfortune. Outside, reporters waited like hungry vultures. Any movement would be news. Some were already whispering, "Valance is bankrupt." Others, "The mansion is going to collapse." The external pressure added to the internal weight. Richard knew that if more walls gave way, it wouldn't just be the house that would fall. It would also be his reputation, built over decades, and that was a price he wasn't willing to pay. The engineers, sensing their boss's emotional state, began promising short deadlines. "We'll stabilize everything in 15 days. We'll guarantee partial safety in 10 days. Each promise sounded desperate, like salespeople trying to push a product at any cost. Richard looked at them and saw only weakness. His trust, previously placed in their technique, evaporated like smoke. None of them seemed to truly know what they were doing. Eli, watching from afar, shook his head. Silently, I thought, they sell solutions like dreams, but the soil doesn't negotiate. The soil only responds to the truth. He continued watering his plants, ignored but increasingly convinced that his time to speak would come. The old man knew the mansion wouldn't fall from above, but from below, and when the truth came, it would be impossible to ignore. That night, Richard locked himself in his office. He stared at the bank account projected on the screen and the crack running across the wall behind his desk. It was as if his fortune and his mansion were crumbling together. 15 million, he muttered bitterly. But deep down, what terrified him most wasn't the money. It was the feeling of being surrounded by men who talked a lot and accomplished little. The next morning, Eli walked through the garden as he did every day. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the sound of brooms sweeping away the library's debris. His keen eyes followed the line of a crack. That ran from the side wall and crept discreetly across the ground, like a living scar. He bent down and touched the fissure with his rough fingers. The path of the crack seemed to point to the heart of the garden. Arriving at the centuries-old fig tree, Eli noticed something the engineers had overlooked. The thick roots, winding underground, were more exposed than before. Small pieces of stone were loosening near the ground, revealing a silent force advancing from below. "It's you, isn't it?" he murmured, running his hand over the trunk. The tree seemed to respond with its imposing silence. The gardener already sensed. The problem stemmed from there. As he watched, 2 engineers walked by with laser equipment. They laughed when they saw him crouch down, getting his hands dirty in the dirt. "Look, the botanist thinks he'll solve what we couldn't." Eli looked up but didn't respond. The old man knew any word would be twisted into a joke. They walked on, adjusting graphs on their tablets, as if the truth lay only on the glowing screens. Even so, Eli decided to give it a try. He approached Richard, who was watching the work with a somber expression. He humbly removed his hat and spoke softly. "Boss, perhaps the problem isn't in the walls, but beneath the floor. The fig trees' roots could be pushing against the foundations." Richard looked at him as if he'd heard heresy. The silence lasted for seconds before turning into mocking laughter. "Roots? You think a handful of roots can defeat concrete and steel?" Richard shook his head, turning to the engineers. "Look, gentlemen, now even the gardener has become a structural expert." Laughter echoed through the room, some nervous, some malicious. Eli remained standing, his hat pressed against his chest, silently, enduring the humiliation. His eyes, however, did not waver. He was certain of what he was saying. One of the engineers, wanting to please his boss, added, "These stories about roots are the work of uneducated people, Mr. Valance. We have scientific methods to identify the true culprits." Eli lowered his head and retreated, feeling the weight of the scorn. But inside, his conviction only grew stronger. He knew the earth doesn't lie, and what he saw every day at the construction sites was living proof of his intuition. As he walked back to the garden, he heard Richard say in the distance, "If I wanted to listen to a gardener, I wouldn't have hired 20 engineers." The sentence burned like a hot iron, but Eli didn't let his resentment show. He kept walking, each step heavy, until he sat down under the shade of the fig tree. He began to hand through the exposed roots, as if petting a dangerous animal. "They'll learn from you yet," he murmured. At the mansion, the engineers continued with their calculations and reports. They presented colorful spreadsheets, millions in value, and elaborate terms. Richard, despite his promises, didn't seem satisfied. His anger grew with each number he heard, and deep down, even without admitting it, the gardener's words echoed in his mind. The idea that a simple tree could be taking over his mansion made him even more furious. Outside, Eli picked up a loose stone near the base of the wall. He pocketed it as he had done before. It was another piece of the puzzle forming in his mind. He didn't have technology, but he had memory and experience. He knew that ancient roots could break through the earth, dislodge rocks, defy all calculations. And that mansion, grand as it was just another victim. The sun set, dyeing the sky red. Richard remained standing in the hall, staring at the cracks that spread like dark veins across the walls. 30 days, he repeated to himself like a curse. In the garden, Eli looked at the same mansion and thought differently. It wasn't a matter of time, but of listening. And as long as no one listened, the house would continue to scream with its creaks and falls. It was dawn when a loud crash woke the entire mansion. The sound was so loud it sounded like thunder splitting the sky in two. Servants ran through the halls, screaming, as a cloud of dust engulfed the east wing. Richard hurried out of his, room, his cane tapping against the floor, and saw the impossible. An entire section of the outer wall had collapsed, dragging a marble balcony with it. The symbol of his grandeur now lay in ruins. The tycoon's eyes widened, his face awash in panic. The East Wing wasn't just any part of the house. It was where he received official visitors, politicians, and diplomats. It was his seat of power. Now, it had been transformed into a pile of stones and dust. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The golden clock in the living room chimed mercilessly. The deadline wasn't getting any shorter, but the desperation was growing. Only 15 days remained until the impossible promise. The engineers rushed in, still in their pajamas with flashlights and makeshift helmets. They inspected the wreckage, but there was no clear explanation. One said it was a material failure, another that it was accumulated infiltration, and yet another that it was initial construction error. Richard exploded. "You know nothing! You're nothing but theorists lost in useless calculations!" His voice echoed between the cracked walls, increasingly resembling the roar of a wounded animal. Meanwhile, Eli watched from afar, under the shade of the fig tree. He saw the crack that extended from the garden to the exact point of collapse. To him, the connection was obvious. The roots, thick and invisible beneath the earth, were slowly pushing against the foundations. But no one spoke to him. He held his hat tightly to his chest as if it were a shield. Silence was his only weapon, and in it he held his certainty. News of the new collapse spread quickly. Reporters camped outside the gates, microphones in hand, eager for images of the tragedy. Headlines began to circulate. "Valence Mansion on the brink of ruin. Marble Colossus crumbles." Each word was a blow to Richard's ego. He felt not only the walls crumble, but his reputation crushed beneath the rubble. And with each passing minute, the world seemed to laugh at his downfall. Inside the mansion, chaos reigned. Servants dragged furniture, trying to salvage what they could from the threatened wing. Dust still hung in the air, making it difficult to breathe. Richard shouted contradictory orders, but no one knew exactly what to do. The engineers argued among themselves, but their voices sounded more like laments than solutions. Fear spread like wildfire, and the mansion increasingly resembled a sinking ship. Eli, walking through the garden, ran his hand over the exposed roots. He felt the living force expanding beneath the soil, slow but relentless. "You'll understand," he murmured to himself. He pocketed a new piece of loose stone he'd found near the fig tree. It was yet another piece of invisible evidence. Perhaps one day, when everything was about to fall, his voice would finally have value. Until then, all that was left was to wait. That night, Richard gathered the engineers in the central hall. 15 days, he repeated, his voice hoarse. "If this mansion falls, you'll fall with me." The tone was threatening, but beneath it lay pure desperation. The technicians promised to redouble their efforts, spoke of heavy machinery, of new calculations, but nothing seemed firm. The magnate knew silently that he was betting against time, and this was the battle he didn't know how to win. As the mansion shook, reporters outside broadcast every detail. Cameras captured cracks opening, doors warping, windows blowing out. The mansion, once a symbol of power, was now a spectacle of tragedy. Richard, sitting in his armchair, watched the television broadcast with wide-eyed eyes, filled with rage. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The empire he had built seemed to be crumbling stone by stone. In the garden, Eli looked up at the starry sky, the mansion behind him creaking like a wounded animal. "The earth speaks, but no one listens," he said softly. The stars reflected in his tired but steady eyes. He knew the time for silence was running out. The magnate, lost in his pride, didn't want to listen. But the mansion screamed in increasingly loud cracks, and soon no one could ignore it anymore. The main dining room was transformed into a war room. Richard ordered all the engineers, butlers, and even some prestigious guests still circulating in the mansion to be gathered. The crack in the East Wing had become national news, and the magnate needed to show strength. His face was hardened, his eyes flashing with hatred. The silence in the room was heavy, as if everyone was waiting for the explosion to happen. He rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and began to speak. 30 days, I said, and 15 have already gone by. 15 days wasted on charts, reports, and empty promises. His voice echoed through the hall, thick with contempt. The engineers shifted in their chairs, avoiding eye contact. Richard tapped his cane against the floor with each sentence, like a judge delivering a sentence. The golden clock seemed to be ticking off each stroke. One of the engineers tried to defend himself, saying they needed more time for in-depth analysis. Richard interrupted him with a brusque gesture. "Time? I already gave you half a month, and what did I get in return? A destroyed library, a collapsed wing, and my reputation being trashed by the newspapers." The engineer shrank back in his chair, red with embarrassment. The reporters' cameras captured every detail, broadcasting live. The press had been invited by the tycoon himself in an attempt to demonstrate control. But the effect was the opposite. The more he shouted, the more he seemed to lose his reason. "You call yourselves experts, educated at the best universities, and you can't overcome a problem that even a child would understand," the audience murmured in shock. The scene wasn't just one of demand. It was one of cruel, explicit, televised humiliation. Richard approached one of the older engineers, pointing his finger in his face. "How many years of education do you have? 10, 20? And what have you brought me? Beautiful words and no solutions." The man, embarrassed, tried to answer, but his voice faltered. Richard laughed, a bitter laugh. "Maybe I should listen to the gardener. At least he knows when a plant is dying." The irony was met with nervous laughter among the guests. Eli, who was nearby, felt the blow like a knife. It wasn't just a joke, it was confirmation of his invisibility. Still, his eyes didn't waver. He knew he was right, but he had no room to speak. He remained silent, observing the scene with a mixture of compassion and indignation. The mansion shook to its foundations, and his master's blindness was costing everyone dearly. The engineers began exchanging resentful glances. Some felt anger toward the tycoon, others self-conscious, but all were overwhelmed by the same fury. Richard paced back and forth like a jailer. "If this house falls, you will no longer have a career. Your names will be remembered as the incompetents who failed where 20 minds together should have triumphed." The threat weighed like a professional death sentence. Outside, the crowd of reporters heard the screams escaping through the windows. The cameras even caught the echo of the word incompetent. Within minutes, the scene would be on the news. Richard didn't realize it, but his attempt to control the narrative was turning into a spectacle of his own tyranny. The more he screamed, the more his image deteriorated. The tycoon, who wanted to appear strong, emerged as a desperate tyrant. Eli, walking discreetly to the garden, muttered to himself, "The house speaks, but they only hear pride." He touched the trunk of the fig tree again, as if consulting a silent oracle. The earth was restless, and he knew that new collapses would come. The engineer's humiliation was only the surface of a much deeper problem. The mansion was not only crumbling in stone, it was crumbling in dignity. At the end of the evening, Richard closed the meeting with a harsh sentence. "You have 15 days to save this mansion, or you will all fall with me." The echo of these words rippled through the hall, etched like a curse. The engineers left the room with their heads down, the guests whispered scandalously, and the press was already publishing savage headlines. In the garden, Eli raised his eyes to the sky and thought, "The house no longer wants silence. It will scream." The next morning, the engineers gathered in the mansion's former music room, which had been converted into a makeshift crisis headquarters. The atmosphere was charged, not only by the dust that still hung in the air, but by the unbearable tension. Papers, tablets, and technical plans were scattered across the tables. The initial silence was broken when one of them, with a trembling voice, said, "We can't hide it anymore. We're directionless." Desperation was beginning to overflow. Immediately, another engineer retorted, "No direction. I told you from the beginning that the problem was structural settlement, but you preferred to bet on infiltration." The tone was accusatory, full of resentment. A third intervened, pounding the table. "And your steel piles? They would cost millions and solve nothing." The room filled with overlapping voices, each trying to assert superiority. What should have been a technical meeting turned into an arena of vanity. Richard, sitting at the head of the table, watched silently, but his gaze was like a volcano about to erupt. Every accusation among the engineers was like fuel for his fury. To him, they were children fighting in a schoolyard, not men of science. "Are you trying to convince me that the salvation of my mansion lies in the hands of cowards?" he thought, banging his cane against the floor. The sound echoed, but no one dared stop arguing. One of the younger men, trying to assert reason, stood up and projected colorful graphs onto the wall. "The data clearly shows ground displacement at specific points." But before he could conclude, another laughed disdainfully. "Graphs don't hold up walls, kid. This mansion needs action, not theories." The youngest blushed, his voice breaking, while the others took advantage of his fragility. The implicit hierarchy was crumbling along with the house. The atmosphere worsened when a veteran engineer accused another of manipulating prices to please Richard. "You only suggest expensive solutions because you want to inflate contracts. You're turning tragedy into profit." The accused stood up, indignant, almost physically assaulting him. Others had to intervene. The room was seething with accusations, bruised egos, and old rivalries. The air smelled of sweat and dust, as if the mansion also absorbed human resentment. Richard stood up suddenly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough!" Silence fell like a blade. "You present yourselves as the greatest minds in this country, but you act like merchants in a cheap market." His face was red, the veins on his neck bulging. "If I wanted clowns, I would hire a circus. I brought engineers," and the words were harsher than any physical punishment. The technicians lowered their eyes, crushed. Outside, Eli watched through the half-open door. She saw the spectacle of shattered egos and thought, "The mansion doesn't fall on its own. It carries the pride of the men who pretend to support it." The gardener knew this dynamic. He had seen families crumble from arrogance long before he had seen walls crumble. Inside the room, the engineers tried to regain their dignity, but it was too late. The words they had spoken could not be taken back. Each one now worked in isolation, like islands in a stormy sea. There was no longer any team spirit, only self-preservation. Every proposal was delivered defensively. Every report seemed like an attempt to salvage reputation. The mansion, as a result, grew even more lonely in its decay. Richard, looking at their defeated faces, felt something he rarely admitted: fear. If those men couldn't unite their efforts, the mansion was doomed. And with it, his name, his glory, his mask of invincibility. He ran his hand over his sweaty forehead and murmured, 15 days. And you bring me childish fights. The confession was whispered, but everyone heard, and the silence that followed was even more painful. At the end of the meeting, the engineers left the room in silence, like defeated soldiers after a lost battle. Richard remained alone, sitting in the leather chair, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. The echo of the discussion still vibrated in his mind. From the garden, Eli looked at the mansion and murmured, "It's not the walls that are crumbling, it's the men." The truth still remained invisible, but it was getting closer to revealing itself. As the engineers dispersed in silence, Eli walked to the garden, seeking solace among the trees. The morning air carried the damp scent of disturbed earth mixed with the dust of landslides. He sat beneath the centuries-old fig tree, the same one he had planted decades ago when he was still a vigorous young man. He ran his hand along its rough trunk, and dormant memories began to awaken. The tree held the key to a secret. At the time, the mansion was still under construction. Eli, a young bricklayer's apprentice, had been tasked with maintaining the grounds. He remembered the first foundations being laid, the hastily fitted stones, the builder's rush to please the magnate of the time. He had discreetly warned about the proximity of the trees, but had been ignored. "Roots can't overcome concrete," the construction foreman had said. The phrase echoed in his mind to this day. Now, staring at the cracks growing through the walls, Eli realized the circle had come full circle. The roots he'd seen sprouting were fulfilling their destiny, growing slowly and relentlessly beneath the mansion. He knew that, over time, nature always exacts its due. And those engineers, no matter how many titles they held, didn't understand the language of the earth. He, yes, did. And with each slap, the mansion confirmed his interpretation. The gardener stood, walking to a spot in the wall where the fissure gaped like a wound. He knelt, pressed his ear against the stone, and heard a barely audible sound, the crack of roots breaking through the subsoil. He smiled sadly. "You're talking," he murmured, "but no one wants to listen." He grabbed a handful of earth and let it run through his fingers, like sand in an hourglass. The mansion's time was running out. Meanwhile, Richard shouted orders inside the house, demanding immediate reports. With each outburst of anger, the old gardener grew more distant. He knew there was no point in taking his observations to the boss. He had already tried and had been ridiculed. But deep within, he carried an unshakable conviction. Without dealing with the roots, nothing would save the mansion. It was like trying to cure a fever without treating the infection. The fault lay in the foundation, not the roof. Eli remembered the morning he had planted the fig tree. The sun was rising, and he, a young man, had proudly placed that sapling in the fertile soil. He never imagined that decades later the same tree would become an enemy of the house. But he didn't blame the fig tree. It had simply grown, fulfilling its natural destiny. The blame lay with the men who ignored the earth's signs and built their pride on living roots, as if they were harmless. The old man stood and walked slowly to the flower bed. Each step seemed heavier, not only because of his age, but because of the responsibility he carried. "I know the truth," he thought, "and when no one else has answers, they'll turn to me." He didn't want recognition. He simply wanted to prevent the entire mansion from being torn down. But to do so, he would have to face Richard's pride and the engineer's vanity. As he pulled weeds, he felt another small stone loosen from the base of the wall. He pocketed it, adding it to the collection he kept secret. Each stone was silent proof, a witness to the truth that only he seemed to see. Perhaps, when disaster loomed, this evidence would serve to open his boss's eyes. Until then, patience would be his strongest weapon. In the distance, he heard the echo of a new discussion among engineers. They were discussing figures, materials, and deadlines, but neither of them mentioned what was before them. Eyes. Eli sighed deeply. They look up, but the answer lies below. The phrase sounded like a mantra in his mind. The mansion, grand and proud, would not fall by its walls. It would fall by the silence of its roots, invisible but relentless. As the sun set, Eli remained seated under the fig tree, gazing at the artificially lit mansion. To everyone else, that house was still a symbol of wealth. To him, it was merely a wounded giant, sustained by illusions. "Soon they will have to listen to me," he murmured. And for the first time, there was no resignation in his voice, but firmness. The gardener knew that the truth was about to emerge from the earth, and no one could stop it. The night was lit by chandeliers and candles when the tycoon decided to hold a charity ball, as if the grandeur of the party would be enough to erase the rumors of decline. Guests arrived in luxurious cars, smiling for the cameras, but whispering among themselves about the recent collapses. Richard, in an impeccable suit, wore a forced smile. It was his last attempt to show the world he was still in control. The ballroom had been meticulously prepared. Musicians tuned instruments, waiters poured champagne into crystal flutes, and couples twirled slowly on the polished floor. The cracks had been covered with tapestries and florals, arrangements like wounds covered by fragile bandages. With each dance step, however, the floor responded with a faint, almost imperceptible groan. Eli, watching from the doorway, frowned. The house was warning. Midway through the waltz, a sharp crack interrupted the music. Guests froze, looking around. The sound came from the central floor where the couples were dancing. A small crack opened between the tiles, barely visible under the lights. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was just their imagination. But Eli knew immediately. The ballroom was giving way. The fig tree, silent outside, seemed to push its truth into the party. The engineers present looked at each other, pale. One whispered, "It's ground settlement." Another replied, "No, it's structural vibration." None of them acknowledged the true gravity. Richard, noticing the fear on their faces, shouted, "Keep the music going! Nothing will interrupt my dance!" The musicians, embarrassed, began playing again, but their nervousness was palpable. Each note sounded like a plea, not a melody. Tension gripped the hall. Then a second crack echoed, louder, deeper. The floor shook, and crystal glasses rattled on the tables. Women screamed, men recoiled, and the orchestra stopped playing altogether. The crack was now visible, crisscrossing part of the hall like a growing scar. The terrified guests began to run for the doors. The ball, a symbol of glory, was transformed into a scene of absolute chaos. Richard, however, remained standing in the center, as if his presence could hold the mansion together. "Nobody leave!" he shouted, his voice cracked with panic. But it was too late. People were pushing and shoving in desperation, dresses tearing, glasses shattering underfoot. The magnate, for the first time, felt the weight of powerlessness. The mansion no longer obeyed his command. It was like a tired body, determined to crumble. Eli advanced through the hall, ignoring the confused looks. He approached the center of the crack and touched the cracked tiles. He felt a vibration coming from below, like a heart beating out of rhythm. He knew exactly what it was. The fig tree's roots were pushing against the subsoil, forcing the hall to surrender. He looked up at Richard and said firmly, "It's not the ceiling. It's the earth that wants to speak." But his voice was lost in the chaos. Police and firefighters arrived in a hurry, summoned by the fleeing guests. Sirens illuminated the mansion's facade with red and blue flashes. Reporters broadcast the tragedy live. Headlines appeared within seconds. "Valence Ball ends in panic." The marble empire collapses before the cameras. Richard, drenched in sweat, realized it wasn't just his house shaking. It was his image, his legend, his very crown crumbling. Amidst the tumult, Eli stood by the crack, steadfast, a silent guardian of truth. He picked up a piece of broken tile and put it in his pocket, adding it to the stones he collected. He knew the time was coming when he could no longer remain silent. The mansion was screaming too loudly to be ignored. The engineers were blind, Richard was deaf, but the earth spoke in increasingly brutal cracks. When the hall finally emptied, Richard slumped into a chair, his face covered with his hands. The echo of panic still echoed off the cracked walls. The golden clock struck midnight, its hand mocking the magnate. 14 days remained. Eli, outside, looked at the fig tree and murmured, "The truth is coming out." For the first time, his eyes showed not resignation, but determination. The next day dawned gloomy, with heavy clouds hanging over the mansion. The panic ball was already making headlines across the country. Richard paced the destroyed ballroom, his cane echoing against the creaking walls. The exhausted engineers presented confusing reports, trying to explain the inexplicable. But their words rang hollow, like broken promises. It was clear. No one had control of the situation. The marble empire was on the brink of collapse. It was then that Eli entered the hall, uninvited. He carried a small wooden box. Inside, he kept the loose stones and pieces of tile he had been secretly collecting. He approached slowly under the suspicious gaze of the engineers and the contempt of the magnate. He placed the box on the central table. "The mansion has been talking for months," he said calmly, "and I heard every word." The silence that followed was profound. Richard stood up furiously. "You dare interrupt again with your nonsense?" The engineers laughed nervously, trying to please their boss, but Eli was undeterred. He took one of the stones from the box and held it up. "These didn't come from the ceiling or the walls, they came from the ground. They're the roots, Mr. Valence, the roots that grow beneath your feet, shifting every foundation that supports this house." His voice echoed firmly, full of conviction. An engineer scoffed. "That's gardener's folklore. You can't explain a structure with rural superstitions." Eli turned to him, his eyes burning with dignity. "Superstition? I planted the centuries-old fig tree when this mansion was still on its foundations. I saw the roots grow, stronger than iron, more persistent than time. You measure with machines, but I measured with my hands and with life." The room fell into an awkward silence. Richard laughed, trying to hide his insecurity. "Do you think you know more than 20 engineers trained at the best universities?" Eli took a step forward. "No more, sir. Just something different. They know calculus. I know roots. They look up. I look down. And it's underneath that your house is dying." The words cut through the air like a blade. For the first time, Richard hesitated. A new crack echoed through the hall, louder than the previous ones. The crack in the floor widened before everyone's eyes, as if confirming the gardener's words. The ground shook, and dust fell from the ceiling. The engineers turned pale. No chart, no report could deny what their eyes saw. The mansion screamed its truth. And Eli was the only one who translated it. Richard's silence was an involuntary acknowledgement of fear. The gardener opened the box of stones before everyone. "Each of these is a message from the earth. I kept them because I knew this moment would come. It's not the roof that gives way, it's not the walls that fail. It's the foundation, corroded by roots no one cared to consider. You call them details, but it's the details that destroy giants." His voice was firm, almost solemn, like a final verdict. The engineers began to whisper among themselves, some admitting quietly that they had never studied this type of natural interference. Others, embarrassed, looked away. Richard, however, was caught between pride and reality. He stared at Eli as if he were both an enemy and a mirror. He knew the explanation made sense, but accepting it meant admitting he had ignored the simple truth out of sheer contempt. The old man took the final step. "You built your mansion on living roots, sir, and now they're taking their toll. You can spend millions on machines, but nothing will change until you confront what's underneath. It's the earth that's winning, not the ceiling that's falling." The words echoed like a sentence. The tycoon, for the first time, received no response. Only silence. Outside, the wind swayed the fig tree's branches, as if confirming the revelation. The mansion trembled, but the heart of the truth was exposed. The gardener, invisible for so long, was now the only voice that made sense, and everyone knew. The final showdown was no longer between engineers and walls, but between pride and humility. The climax had arrived, and the tycoon could no longer escape reality. The hall fell silent after Eli's words. The once imposing magnate seemed cowed in his own shadow. The sound of the golden clock marked each second like a hammer blow of judgment. The engineers, once arrogant, now stared at the floor, unable to argue back. For the first time, the weight of truth rested not on graphs or figures, but on the old gardener's calloused hands. Richard looked up at Eli. There was anger, but also a flicker of involuntary respect. "Are you saying all this is the fault of a tree?" The question sounded more like desperation than irony. Eli replied calmly, "Not a tree, but the pride that ignored it. The earth never forgets what lies beneath it." The simple words pierced the magnate's armor. The engineers, pressured by the impending collapse, began to admit the explanation was plausible. "It's possible. Roots can cause severe settlement. We've never studied it at this level, but it makes sense." Murmurs of acceptance erupted like sparks. Richard took a deep breath, feeling his own arrogance crumble. For the first time in decades, he realized he couldn't buy all the answers with money. Some came from eyes that knew how to look down. He ordered the fig tree examined and, in front of everyone, authorized excavations around the base of the house. Machines arrived, digging deep. And there they were, thick roots, as firm as iron, pushing against the mansion's foundations. The impact was collective. The engineers fell silent, Richard paled, and Eli simply lowered his head in silence. The earth had confirmed what he had always said. With forced humility, Richard approached the gardener. His lips trembled, the words struggling to come out. "I made a mistake." The confession felt heavier than any stone rolled away. Eli didn't smile, just nodded. "You didn't make a mistake alone, sir. You made a mistake because you didn't want to listen." The magnate looked away, but he felt the weight of the sentence. It was more than a lesson about foundations. It was about the life he had chosen to live, always above, never below. The engineers put together an emergency plan, now under Eli's watchful eye. He didn't replace calculations or machines, but guided the excavations with the precision of someone who knew every vein of the earth. Here it is fragile, here it is firm. His words, previously ignored, were now taken down as orders. The gardener, invisible for decades, had become the voice everyone listened to, and the mansion slowly began to stabilize. Richard watched in silence, overcome with conflicting feelings. Wounded pride, suppressed anger, but also a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he wasn't the one holding the solution. For the first time, he wasn't the wisest person in the room. He saw Eli guiding men in suits and diplomas as if they were apprentices. And deep down, he understood. Wisdom isn't just in books, but in the time lived, in the ground walked. Days later, with the mansion stabilized, Richard summoned everyone to the restored hall. There were no reporters, only those present at the tragedy. She looked at Eli, her voice calmer than ever. "This man saved my home. He saved my name. And he did it without asking for anything in return." The recognition, however brief, fell like a thunderbolt among the engineers. Eli merely bowed his head, humble as ever. Respect was not in the words, but in the silence. In the garden, the fig tree stood tall, untouched. Richard wanted to cut it down, but Eli convinced him to keep it. It's not an enemy, it simply fulfilled its destiny. The magnate accepted it silently, as one might accept a scar. The tree would remain there, not as a threat, but as a reminder. The mansion would never be the same, and neither would he. His pride had faded, but the lesson remained, rooted in the earth. In the final scene, Eli walks through the garden at dusk, hat in hand, gazing at the restored mansion. His eyes shine not with vanity, but with serenity. A lifetime of silence, and finally, his voice has been heard. How many times do we disregard the simple experience of those who truly know? The terrain we tread? And have you ever ignored a truth because it seemed too simple?